14. Our place in God. 1. There is one determination that cannot be eliminated from the concept of being without so far stretching the concept that its retention would be empty. To have being is to be knowable. Thus Westerners who have attributed being to God have also tended to teach that God is intrinsically knowable, even if the proposition is heavily qualified with respect to our knowledge, while Orthodox thinkers who have said that God is beyond being have correspondingly taught that God is beyond a knowledge, although just so not simply unknown. At this juncture we have chosen, without prejudice, to make the Western move. By badly wrenching the received concept, we attribute being to God and so attribute no ability to Him. But how can it be that God is known by creatures? The fatal error here is to think of God as simply one thing and creatures as another, and then inquire how the second, with its capabilities, can know the first, given its characteristics. If we make this mistake, we will probably first conceive the relation causally, creatures. Knowledge, or love or enjoyment, of God will be explained by effects or influences God and creatures are thought to have on each other. Inevitably, we will then try to discern the mutual balance of these reciprocal causalities. Much of church history can be interpreted as the continuing disaster of this attempt. We need only remind ourselves of the Western Church's interminable controversies about grace. We will only, for example, worry whether grace is irresistible if we think of grace as work done by God upon extrinsic objects, and are then, when the question is put this way, rightly concerned for a reciprocal free agency of those objects. To repair the embarrassments encountered along the way of this alienation, we may resort to language designed to blur the boundary between God and creature. The inheritance of Mediterranean antiquity will be immediately at hand, with its hope that reality other than God is not finally other. And, indeed, theology cannot do without the sort of language often called mystical, while first level. Proclamation and prayer can even less dispense with it. But the language is perilous just at our current point. It is not because we blend into God or lose ourselves in Him that the relations between Him and us are not merely extrinsic. We will avoid this path only if we remember two ways in which the relation between God and creatures is not simple. The more fundamental such complexity, and at this point too the more often forgotten, is that God is not monadic but triune. But before we return to that dominant concern, we must note the other complexity. God's knowability cannot be understood in isolation from other ways in which being is openness to participation. Being is truth, to be knowable. Medieval thinkers said that a concept that had this relation to the concept of being was convertibles with it, and called it a transcendental concept. And they listed not one but four transcendentals: unity, truth, goodness, and beauty. Of these, unity and its convertibility with being were assumed and in fact analyzed throughout the previous chapter. But that leaves three, of which two have hardly been mentioned. Whatever is, must be true and good and beautiful. God is being, and therefore He is truth and goodness and beauty. Adjectively, He is knowable and lovable and enjoyable. None of the three can be understood in isolation from the others. With this teaching, the medievals continued and solidified a tradition that has been continuous through the history of Western thinking. It carried through also modernity's turn to the subject, perhaps born especially by Kant's division of subjectivity among the matter of the three critiques of cognition, moral reason, and aesthetic judgment, united at the transcendental unity of apperception, the focus point of consciousness. It shaped 19th and early 20th century Neo-Protestantism through the phenomenological structure underlying the period's inaugurating document, Schleiermacher's Speeches on Religion. The human subject is passively related to its object in knowing, it is actively related to its object in willing, and knowing and willing emerge from and come together in aesthetic feeling for the object, in which the subject neither acts upon the object nor is acted upon by it, and so is one with it. The present chapter will follow this tradition, and consider God's knowability and lovability and enjoyability as aspects of God's one being in its openness to participation. So we come to our second mandate: we must understand this openness in Trinitarian fashion. At this stage of our discussion it is obvious what the chief propositions must be. God is truth and goodness and beauty because and only because knowledge and love and enjoyment. in fact occur in the triune life. And God's truth and goodness and beauty are his knowability and lovability and enjoyability, because the triune life opens to others than the three who are God. Father, Son, and Spirit are persons whose communal life is God. Can they indeed bring other persons into that life, as we have in previous chapters often supposed? If the bringing of other persons into the triune life were in such fashion to deify them as to increase the number of persons whose life it is, if it added to the identities of God, then God could not accommodate them without undoing himself. For he is the God he is only as the life of Jesus and his Father in their spirit. An indefinitely expanding set of identities of God would indeed be infinity of the sort the Greeks recognized as dissolution. But a divine identity, we have said, is nothing but a subsistent relation to the other identities, each of the three is primeval to the other two. Therefore, one who comes into this life does not thereby become a divine identity, does not become one of those whose life it is. A divine identity is a persona just of that dramatis Dei actually told by the gospel, someone who is not eternally begotten of the Father, or liberated by the Spirit to be the Father's identifying object of love, or established by some other of the narrative relations told of God in Scripture. However else he or she may be related in God, is not a divine identity. The point here to be made is the affirmative. God can indeed, if he chooses, accommodate other persons in his life without distorting that life. God, to state it as boldly as possible, is Rumi. Indeed, if we were to list divine attributes, Ruminess would have to come next after jealousy. He can, if he chooses, distinguish himself from others not by excluding them but by including them. We must venture thus far into the doctrine of creation, with propositions that can be justified only later. Whether or not we wish to call God's pure duration his uncreated time, God as Father, Son, and Spirit can make room in himself for others, and the room that he makes is our created time. The opening of that room is the act of creation. 2. Therefore God's knowability is not a dispositional property, like breakability or legibility. That is, it is not his possession of qualities that adapt him to satisfy some exterior effort, in this case our cognitive effort. God is knowable because and only because he is in fact known. We remember Thomas's maxim, there is no form of deity metaphysically or otherwise prior to its actuality. God is first known by himself, the Father is freed by the Spirit to find himself in the Son, in the Spirit, the Son knows himself loved by the Father and just so knows the Father, the Spirit knows the love he brings to the Father and the Son. Nor again is this perichoretic knowing the activation of a dispositional property possessed by God. It is an aspect of that mutual life of Father, Son, and Spirit which is God. With respect to the knowledge of God, East and West are often thought to disagree drastically, but there is no disagreement on our present fundamental point. God, East and West have agreed, is not known by us because he is amenable to the exercise of our cognitive powers. He is known by us in that he grants us what we could never reach, or even know we could or should reach. He takes us into his own knowledge of himself. Any apparent contradictions between typical Eastern and Western positions at this point result from different strategies with the concept of being and consequent cross-purposes of language. Thus Gregory Palamas, whom we may again take as archetypical for the East, says that even Orthodoxy's beloved, apophatic theology, the theology of progressive renunciation of propositions and images, cannot attain more than a certain cognition of phenomena that pertain to God, which is a mere image of the mind's true fulfillment. For even apophatic theology is the activation of a natural capacity, whereas those who truly know God suffer a gift of what is beyond them. The gift that transcends the mind's natural cognitive capacity is union with God, the grace of adoption, the deifying gift of the Spirit. And thus the saints do in fact suffer and see the things of God, ta thea, for God is invisible to creatures but is not invisible to himself. For the West, we have been in these last chapters adducing Thomas. According to him, God as being is knowable. He is known to himself and to his perfected saints in glory, even in his essence. Moreover, the vision by which we will then see God in his essence is the same as the vision by which God sees himself. All knowledge of God is derived from this knowledge, and is thus knowledge in which our natural cognitive capacities are made holy to transcend themselves. Faith is precisely the gift of this transcendence. God is knowable in that he actually knows himself, in the mutual life of Father, Son, and Spirit, which as personal is mutual acquaintance and understanding. He is then known by us in that this triune life is in its actuality a life with us. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Lord has introduced himself to us, and just so introduced us into the communal life that he is. As God has introduced himself to us, he is hypostatically present to and in our community. As we in this community know each other, we know God. If we may at all speak of a condition of the possibility of our knowing God, one located on our side of the relation, this condition is the Church. We will return to this in the second volume of the work. We know God in that the Word of God, that is God, that is homoousios with the Father, is actual only as conversation with us. If we ask what the divine Word would have been without us, we, again, do not know what we are asking. Since we are so insisting upon actuality, we must make the insistence itself actual. When the gospel of Christ's resurrection is spoken by and heard in the Church, it is the very word of the Father to the Son that we hear. When the Church prays to the Father in the Son's name, she is taken into the obedient response of the Son to what the Father tells him. As the Church speaks and hears the gospel, and as the Church responds in prayer and confession, the Church's life is a great conversation, and this conversation is none other than our participation in the converse of the Father and the Son in the Spirit. As the Church is enlivened and empowered by this hearing and answer, this inspiration is by none other than that Spirit who is the life between the Father and the Son. So do we know God? Here an endemic question announces itself. In all true mutual discourse, we argued in an earlier connection, each must be both subject for and object of the other. As I am present to address you, I am a subject and you are my object. But if this is not reciprocal, if I evade being your object and so frustrate your presence as subject, I enslave you. Is God our object? Can God be an object? That is, can he be in true and free converse with us? The question bites more sharply if we take the earlier discussion of embodiment the other way around, and observe that a person's objectivity is his or her body. As God addresses us, how do we find him to respond? Does God have a body? An unexamined presupposition of God's non-objectivity or non-embodiment runs through much of the tradition. Thus, at systematic theology's beginning, Origen taught that the mutual knowing of the Father and the Son was not personal interchange but sheer mental knowing, because whatever pertains to body must not be thought of the Father or the Son. And at a very distant and theologically different time, God's non-objectifiability was a methodological principle of Neo-Protestantism that continued to unite its two chief overthrowers, Bultmann and Barth, even after they come to disagree on much else. But, of course, God does in fact have a body, the body born of Mary and risen into the Church and its sacraments. When the disciples turn to the object Jesus, or when we turn to the object loaf and cup or bath or gathered community, we have precisely the body of God for our object. What must here be emphasized is that the discourse that is God's life is not in fact another discourse than that between Jesus and his Father in their spirit, in which we join. That God is an object and so a partner of true free interchange is a fact not only of our converse with him but of the converse he is, and it is the one in that it is the other. The Son, to whom the Father looks, is the hanged man on Golgotha. It is the truth of our knowledge of God. God gives himself to be our object, and the object that he gives to us is none other than the object as which he is given to himself. God says at once to himself and to us, "Who I am is the Father of that man Jesus." Because he says it first to himself, it is true when he says it to us. Or we may work the matter out Christologically and pneumatologically. The risen Jesus is God as our object. He is also the human being who knows this object, himself, as God. If we speak of the knowledge of God that is possessed only by God himself and by his perfected saints, it is Christ's self-knowledge that is the identity of God's knowledge of himself and this human knowledge of God. The saints and we, in our temporarily different ways, share Christ's knowledge by the Spirit. For the Spirit is Christ's Spirit and yet other than he, who shares Christ's ability to speak truly of God when and where he is pleased to do so. And the Spirit is the very life of the saints. 3. There is speaking and hearing in God, and the knowledge of God is participation in this discourse. Is there also appearing and seeing in God? Theological and pious tradition has in fact spoken more freely of the Father's seeing himself in the Son, or of the saints' vision of God, than it has of discourse in God or of the saints joining that discourse. The present work hopes to amend the tradition in this respect. But we are now in position to acknowledge also the more traditional concern. If there is converse in God, there is also appearing and seeing, for free converse demands embodiment and bodies appear and are seen. If God is known, and if this knowledge does not undo its subjects, then God is seen. No one indeed can see God and live. This is yet another way of explaining why Jesus died. Jesus did then die, and he rose again, and in that this is true it is also written, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. As might be expected, Gregory Palamas cannot here be outdone, since God is not invisible to himself, and will, in the kingdom, be the one who sees through our souls and even through our bodies. We will then see the divine and inaccessible light by bodily organs. We may note the eschatological future tense of Palamas' proposition, and allow the observation to carry us to a final point to be made about God's knowability. Not only do Palamas and Thomas agree that we know God in that he takes us beyond ourselves, they also agree that this beyond is the beyond of the kingdom. Palamas has, again, the more dramatic expression, the same divine light that was seen by the apostles on Tabor and is now seen by purified souls, is the substance of the eternal blessings to come. The vision that was revealed to the apostles has the weight of Christ's future coming. Our knowledge of God is now through a glass darkly, because it is knowledge across the eschatological boundary, across the discontinuity of our own death and resurrection. Of our two guides through this section, Thomas made the more explicit attempt to reckon with this character of our knowledge by his doctrine of analogy, and we will return to this teaching when we more directly consider not God's knowability but the character of our knowing. For now it suffices, we know God as and only as we, killed with Christ but not yet risen, share the knowledge that is part of the life of the kingdom, only as we in the church overhear the discourse of God and his saints. 4. The divine conversation has authoritative moral content. This is true even among the three of God. The Father gives the Son a specific mission of atonement and of a new commandment. The Son responds, "Thy will be done." The Spirit lovingly enables the mission and the obedience. The divine conversation by participation in which we know God is concretely his moral reasoning and willing. The divine perichoresis in this aspect is righteousness in that it is a perfect harmony in which each of the divine persons fully accepts what he is for the others. Insofar as God shares this discourse with creatures, whether as law or gospel in the Pauline or Reformation senses, it becomes his communication to us of his moral intention. It becomes what Israel called Torah. Our inclusion in the triune discourse is an initiation into the triune harmony, into God's righteousness. Just so, it is guidance into faithful and dedicated community also with one another, into created righteousness. To know God is to know his moral will. Or we may put it so. God's grant of participation in the triune discourse is not random but purposeful. He lives with us in order that we may live with him. He lives with us in order that we may honor him and no other God, in order that we may be faithful to community rather than individually autonomous, in order that we may serve life rather than death. We come to the same place. God includes us just as and only as he speaks Torah to us. That God thus honors and benefits us is his goodness to us, and of a goodness in God that was not his goodness to us we yet again may not speculate. The great blessing that God bestows on creatures is his gift of the commandments. A passage from Deuteronomy must be cited at greater length. Moses speaks, "And now, Omicron Israel, give heed to the statutes and the ordinances which I teach you, that you may live. That will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and ordinances so righteous as all this law?" It is the two traditions in which Israel's faith becomes most self-reflective, most theological in our sense of a second-level discourse, that most explicitly adduce the character of Torah as blessing. The Deuteronomistic theology reflects endlessly on the beneficial fact itself, on the goodness of Torah. The tradition of wisdom, perhaps particularly as it appears in Psalms shaped by that tradition, praises the lovability of Torah. We continue first with Deuteronomy. Israel's status as favorite among peoples is that Moses charged us with the law, as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. The Lord's commands are not arbitrary or an alien imposition, but are for our well-being, for our lasting good, to keep us alive. Indeed, they are our very life. This is because they are that which enables human life in the first place. One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Therefore, if we wish to live, we must put these words in our heart and soul, recite them to our children and make them our conversation at home and away, rising and retiring. We will bind the commandments as signs on our bodies and write them on our doorposts. Just so, the commands are not too hard, they are rather the nearest and most obvious thing in life. God's commands do not infringe our autonomy. To use that perilous word, they Torah, God's sharing with us of His moral intention for us, is therefore lovable, as the Psalms say again and again. It is the delight of the righteous to meditate on God's law day and night. The ordinances of the Lord are more desirable than gold and sweeter than honey. Simply, the righteous person can say that he obeys the commandments because I love them, because they are the joy of my heart. Martin Luther, in the part of his large catechism devoted to explanation of the Apostles' Creed, has two statements of God's purpose with the story they tell, that is, with the gospel. Both relate the gospel to the 10 Commandments, which were the first and just previous catechetical item. According to his introduction to the Creed, the Gospel tells us what sort of person God is, why we can dare to obey the mandate of the first table of the 10 Commandments and put all our faith in Him. According to his summation of the Creed, by the Gospel we acquire desire and love, lust and liebe, for all God's commandments, in view of the Western Church's endemic controversy about the relation of laws and gospel, and of what is usually thought to be Luther's position in that controversy, his identification between a passion for the 10 Commandments and faith in God may be somewhat unexpected, just so his testimony is the more interesting. No more as goodness than as truth is God a form to be actualized. No more is God's lovability a dispositional property than is His knowability. God is good because He does good. He is lovable because He is loved. And no more is our righteousness the success of our moral capacity than is our knowledge of God the success of our cognitive capacity. If we love the lovable God, and so truly find one another as well, this occurs in the same elevation beyond ourselves as does our knowledge of God. There is, of course, a long history of controversy, particularly in the Western Church, about justification, about the way we become just or righteous. We will have to return to its tangle of misunderstanding and genuine disagreement. Yet it seems probable that serious theologians of the Roman Catholic Church and the Reformation never truly disagreed about the point just here made. In any case, the parties can now say together, our entire hope of justification and salvation rests on Christ Jesus and on the gospel whereby the good news of God's merciful action is made known. We do not place our ultimate trust in anything other than God's promise and saving work in Christ. This excludes ultimate reliance on our faith, virtues, or merits, even though we acknowledge God's working in these by grace alone. 5. Readers may well have worried that our discussion of God's knowability was not balanced by acknowledgement of His hiddenness. Augustine's dictum states, after all, an insight shared one way or another by the whole tradition, if I have spoken of God, what I have said is not what I wanted to say. How would I know that, unless I knew that God is ineffable? And yet what I have said would not have been said, if He were ineffable. This antinomy is perhaps better guarded in silence than pointed out in speech. There was a reason for postponement. Had we undertaken the matter before discussion also of God's goodness, as a merely epistemological phenomenon, we would have been too tempted by the root error among currently cultivated heresies, the interpretation of God's hiddenness as metaphysical distance, in contradiction to Nietzsche. According to recently popular teaching, no human discourse can represent God fully, because of His absence. From our direct experience, the best we can do, peering through the metaphysical spaces is try through words to convey glimpses of the divine. The opposite position would be closer to the truth, that God is hidden precisely by his offensive availability in our world. God's proper hiddenness is both cognitive and moral, and is the first only as it is the second. When the Lord, in the prophecies of the Isaiah of the exile, says that as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts, it is clear that the thoughts in question are moral intentions. And their height above us is their unpredictability by our moral standards. God, despite all his promises, has undone Israel and despite all his threats intends to restore Israel. When Isaiah asks, "Whom did the Lord consult for his enlightenment?" it is the path of justice that is the content of enlightenment. When Paul, quoting Isaiah and Job, says that God's judgments are unsearchable and asks, "Who has known the mind of the Lord?" it is the unforeseeable paths of God's election that evoke his wonder. God is not hidden because he holds back some part of the self-knowing he shares with us, but because that self-knowing is alive and moving and we cannot keep up with its moral intentions. Our ignorance of God is not a sort of balance to our knowledge of him, it is that we cannot at any moment of his life with us fully understand what he is up to next. This ignorance may be considered in two ways. In the one way, it is intrinsic to the situation of finite creatures given to share the infinite life that is the triune God. We could again appeal to Gregory of Nyssa, but let us instead invoke a modern. Jonathan Edwards calls our knowledge and love of God our conformity to God's knowledge and love of himself. And since God's ability to communicate himself is infinite, this conformity can and must increase indefinitely, without ever coming to rest. The good that is in the creatures comes forever nearer and nearer to an identity with that which is in God. Because God is infinite, even in the final state of the saints in God, those that shall render him his tribute of glory will to eternity be increasing in their knowledge of his glory without ever exhausting it. In another way, God's hiddenness can be seen as posited by the contingently actual history that God as triune lives with us, indeed by the contingent character of the object as which he is known by us. For that object is a crucified man. We may strive to free ourselves of pagan antiquity's metaphysical prejudice, according to which God is intrinsically impassible. But the religious impulse itself, without which we would not worry about God in the first place, will never desist from offense at God's self-presentation as a victim. God must be powerful and sweep all before him, else why do we need him? No one has seen so deeply here as Martin Luther. Faith is the conviction of things not seen. Therefore, said Luther, that which is to be believed, God and his goodness, must be hidden. And it cannot be more deeply hidden than under a contrary object. Thus when God makes alive he does it by killing, when he justifies he does it by making guilty, when he takes into heaven he does it by sending to hell. God is thus hidden in the whole course of his history with us, but he is doubly, and so salvifically, so hidden precisely as a Jesus crucified, in whom are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, but hidden. It is just so that the conviction of things not seen must also be the assurance of what can only be hoped for. 6. One transcendental remains, God is beauty, to be God is be enjoyable. In that the triune conversation is righteousness, it is the perfect harmony of the triune communal life. And the harmony of discourse taken for itself is its beauty, more precisely, its music. The necessary doctrine here is analogous to that about God's truth and goodness and need not be developed at length. God's beauty also is not a dispositional property, waiting for our action, in this instance for our enjoyment. God's beauty is the actual living exchange between Father, Son, and Spirit, as this exchange is perfect simply as exchange, as it sings. The harmony of Father, Son, and Spirit, the triune perichoresis, transcends its character as goodness because it has no purpose beyond itself, being itself God. And the harmony of a discourse thus taken for itself and for the sake of itself, is its beauty, its aesthetic entity. Correspondingly, our enjoyment of God is that we are taken into the triune singing. Perhaps we may say we are allowed to double the parts. And here too we must insist on concreteness. That the proclamation and prayer of the Church regularly bursts into beauty, indeed seems to insist on music and choreography and setting, is not an adventitious hankering to decorate. A congregation singing a hymn of praise to the Father is doubling the Son's praise, and the surge of rhythm and melody is the surge of the Spirit's glorification of the Father and the Son. We introduced Jonathan Edwards at the exact point where the development began to lead to the present point. And now we may simply appropriate his insight. That exquisite spiritual proportion that will be the eschatological perfection of creation, and that is now its inner meaning, is, according to Edwards, that of a very complex tune, where respect is to be had to the proportion of a great many notes together. If we try to conceive the kingdom, that society in the highest degree happy, we should think of them sweetly singing to each other. All such beauty of the creation, now or in the kingdom, is constituted by sweet mutual consents with the persons of the Trinity, the supreme harmony of all. Thus the holiness of God himself is a sweet conjunction of greatness and mercy, with nothing in it but what is ravishingly lovely. Every theology in one way or another ranks the transcendentals. Most often, it is said that God is goodness and beauty because he is truth. Edwards ranked the transcendentals otherwise: God is truth and goodness because he is beauty, beauty of the sort that music has. In thus privileging beauty, Edwards belonged to a minority tradition, whose most famous exponent was the great overcomer of the Enlightenment Edwards celebrated, Friedrich Schleiermacher, although Schleiermacher oddly missed the triune and so musical nature of God's beauty. We will follow Edwards's and Schleiermacher's ranking. Unity is convertibles with being in a different way than are the other three. To grasp that what is not somehow a unit cannot be anything at all requires no insight. Our discussion of God's being in the previous chapter was therefore itself our analysis of his oneness. That leaves the three transcendentals of this chapter. Of these, as Schleiermacher maintained, beauty is both ground and union of the other two, and so is the concretion of the unity that being directly is. God is truth and goodness at once in that he is one in his beauty, or as the scriptures speak, in his glory. To conclude, we may invoke Thomas's maxim a last time: the discourse that is God is not other than its sheer occurrence as the divine perichoresis. Therefore the discourse that is God may be thought of not only as singing but even as pure music. It is the peculiarity of the aesthetic that in apprehending beauty we abstract from the content of discourse without becoming abstract in our understanding. God, we may thus say, is a melody. And as there are three singers who take each their part, a further specification suggests itself: the melody is fugued. We must note what has just happened. The apprehension of God as beauty, in its concrete abstraction, has led us to another proposition of the same character as those in the preceding chapter, in which we said that God is an event, a person, a decision, and a conversation. The phrase "the one God" directs us finally to the sheer perichoresis of Father, Son, and Spirit, and that is to their communal music. We close the doctrine of God with this evocation of God's being, beyond which there is no more to say: God is a great fugue. There is nothing so capacious as a fugue.